Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Cats HQ podcast. I'm John Hale, the CJ's UK football beat writer, sitting alongside Fletcher Page, the CJ's UK basketball beat writer. We're a couple days now removed from the UK spring game that wrapped up spring football, so we'll break that down, go in depth about what the Kentucky football team maybe gained and lost over the course of spring practice. Fletcher also was in Louisville last week for practice before the Derby Classic to see Chide Gilgis Alexander, as Fletcher just told me how he was saying it, and Mark Smith before they played in that game on Saturday. There's more recruiting news with Jared Vanderbilt's injury from the Hoop Summit. Is it the Hoop Summit or the Jordan Brand Classic? And then, of course, also some additions. We talked last week about Jamar Baker's commitment to Kentucky. What's next with the recruiting class? We'll get into that. Maybe a little UK baseball talk with U of L coming to town on Tuesday night in Lexington. But let's get started with the spring game. Both Fletcher and I were on hand Friday night, sorry. I'm still not used to that schedule change for the spring game. As the white team, made up mostly of Kentucky backups, played pretty close for a first half, tied 14-14 at halftime, but then faltered down the stretch to give the blue team, made up of Kentucky starters for the most part, a decisive 31-14 victory in the spring game. Big stories coming out of the spring game. Steven Johnson, the presumptive starter at quarterback, was just okay. Started strong, was really good. Probably the first quarter or so, then missed some deep passes in the second quarter. Went on a long, cold streak, and really got outplayed by Gunnar Hoke, who was the number 2 quarterback starting for the white team against the first team defense. For most of the game, Hoke was excellent in the first half against the starting defense to lead them to that 14-14 tie, then got 2 series late in the game as the first team offense led them to touchdowns both games. I don't think anybody thinks there's a spring or a quarterback competition burgeoning here. I think Steven Johnson's still the starter. We've said that many, many times on this podcast. But Gunnar Hoke was really good, and I got to imagine that they feel much better about their quarterback situation, their depth at least, heading out of spring.
Yeah, certainly. I don't want to make excuses for Steven Johnson, but I get the impression that that pickup style atmospheres or scrimmages with mixed rosters, I just don't think that's really an atmosphere that Steven Johnson is going to excel at. I thought he looked sharp early, missed some deep balls, but yeah, I think the overall takeaway from the quarterback position is that right now, if you're Eddie Gran and the Wildcats offensive staff, you got to feel pretty good, top to bottom with what you set yourself up with at the quarterback position.
Yeah, Drew Barker, who everybody entered the spring wondering could he push Steven Johnson. Practice for this in spring practice, the second half of the spring was more involved in terms of scrimmages and team drills, 11 on 11, those kind of things here and there. They held him out of the spring game, just out of precaution to hope that the back injury didn't get aggravated by the adrenaline of the moment and being in front of the crowd. So we did not get to see him, but I think we end spring with the question of whether Gunnar Hoke can push Steven Johnson. Steven's going to start the opener. I'd still be shocked if that does not happen. But Gunnar was really good. Looking at the stats here, he was 12 for 18 for 92 yards and 2 touchdowns in the first half against the first team defense. And then with those 2 drives at the end of the game and the first team offense, he was 4-6 for 82 yards, no scores, but he did rush for a 5-yard touchdown. He hit a big gain to K'Wan Ross at the end of the game. Was really the only deep pass that either quarterback completed in the entire game. That was a problem for Steven. You've heard what we had to say about the quarterback battle, whether or not it's going to be a competition. Here's a couple minutes of UK quarterbacks coach and co-offensive coordinator Darren Hinshaw after the scrimmage talking about what he saw from those 2 guys.
Now, Steven's had a great spring, okay? He's really done a great job with leadership. He's done a great job on practices and scrimmages and everything that he's done. The deal today is he got a little greedy, okay? He was trying to throw the ball too far down the field, looking at one receiver. He was trying to throw deep shots. And when you get caught doing that sometimes, the pocket's going to close down. You got to get off of it, and you got to go to your next read and your next read, get a completion, and go to the next throw. I wasn't over there because I was over with the white team, so I didn't get to correct him. And I'm screaming, but he couldn't hear me. But at the same time, he had a good spring. He's really done a great job. This spring game, the interception was a forced throw that he hadn't made all spring. But again, that's going to humble him right now at this point, and he's going to get ready, roll his shirt sleeves up, and get ready for this summer. But again, I'm very proud of him where he's been, what he's done as a quarterback this spring, and I'm really looking forward to him this summer and fall coming along strong.
You said 2 weeks ago we can win SEC games with Gunnar Hoke. You You seem to be smirking like I told you so now. I mean,
Yeah.
How did tonight sort of validate to you in a
It did.
situation?
I mean, to me, Gunnar did what he's been doing all spring. Now, it does validate it in a spring game atmosphere, and he's also going against the ones. He was going against the blue team and led them to some big throws and some good decisions, and I'm really proud of him. I don't want him to get a big head, Gunnar. Don't get a big head now. We got a big summer, but he did a good job. He threw 2 touchdowns. He ran a touchdown. Again, really proud of Gunnar. He needs to continue to get better, continue to get vocal, and be a leader, so when his time comes, he's ready to go play.
Can you challenge him, Stephen?
Well, I tell you, the deal is I want all our quarterbacks challenging everybody. So, yes, I want him challenging Steven. I want everybody to push Steven. I want Drew pushing Steven. I want everybody pushing everybody. That's what makes our room better. We have a tight, close room. They love each other. They work hard together. They understand that they all want everybody to do well in that room. Okay, and we're going to continue to be like that. Continue to produce quarterbacks. Again, like I said, with Steven got a little greedy tonight, and again, he'll learn from that, and we'll go into it that we don't have to throw the deep ball every single pass. Again, find your checkdowns, get the ball complete.
So that's pretty much what you would expect a coach to say afterwards in terms of, we want everybody to push Steven. That's what they're looking for in terms of depth and competition, making everybody better. I would expect that if Drew Barker is healthy entering fall, he's still the number 2 quarterback just because of experience. But after the game, while we may not think there's going to be a new starter, I do think that Gunnar Hoke was impressive enough in that scrimmage to it's no foregone conclusion that he won't be the primary backup in week 1.
Yeah, and the funny thing with Steven is that's kind of what he was so impressive with last season was that he didn't always take chances. He took the safe route at times. Some of those deep balls that he threw, I thought looked really good. It was almost like he was trying to just show that aspect of his game. He had a couple. Again, I feel like this kind of setup where where the whistle was blown, if the pocket collapses, the quarterbacks aren't live. He had one deep ball that was completed that was called back, said that it would have been a sack. He had a throw to Charles Walker. So I thought the deep ball looked good. It wasn't completed all the time, and you kind of got the impression that Steven was letting those things fly just because he could.
Yeah, Steven was 8 for 18 for 106 yards with an interception. A couple of those, like Fletcher mentioned, the deep ball to Charles Walker got called back. That would have been a touchdown. And I think that's a play. I haven't watched the replay, but it looked like a play where he might have been able to elude that pressure and complete that one anyway. There were a couple more. He just overthrew Dorian Baker on one that I can remember specifically. My one concern a little bit is Steven was so good at those deep passes last year with Jeff Badette in particular and Garrett Johnson to maybe a lesser extent. Badette's obviously transferred to Oklahoma, was the fastest player on the roster. Garrett Johnson did not play in the spring game with a hamstring injury. So those 2 real speed threats from the offense last year were not there on Friday night. And I wonder how long it's going to take Steven Johnson to adjust on those deep passes to guys who are maybe not as fast as Jeff Badette or Garrett Johnson. It looked like he was throwing those passes, to me at least, to a guy who had that speed, and the receiver out there running the route just wasn't that fast to get to the point where he was throwing the ball. He told me afterwards, I asked him that question, that he thinks their chemistry is perfect, that they've been hitting those passes in practice to guys like Dorian Baker and Tavin Richardson and Blake Bone and K1 Ross throughout the spring, so he wasn't that worried about it. He thought he was just too greedy on Friday and a little too amped up, throwing it too far. So we'll see, but I think that's at least something to watch heading into the summer.
Definitely. It felt disjointed. Last season, Steven was working with an offense that rushed for over 3,000 yards, and they had Benny Snell and Boone Williams and JoJo Kemp. So some of those deep passes were created from the run. And so, again, this spring game, you've got rosters that are being mixed and matched, and players were switching teams. And so not necessarily work and play to play. Sometimes it felt like, it almost felt like an all-star basketball game.
I will say, while we're on the topic of receivers, that I thought Charles Walker looked like their best receiver on Friday night.
He did.
He had the one that was called back, obviously, but he had a couple other catches, 49 yards total. Would have had a long one that I think was probably at least 30 yards. He looked really good. I think it's easy to forget about him as a senior walk-on who's not made a ton, or former walk-on who's not made a ton of catches in his career. Obviously was a weapon on punt return last year. He was the returner again on Friday night, even though they weren't live. He just, sat back there and called fair catches every time. So he's going to be involved. But when you think about guys like Garrett Johnson, who's going to play in the slot when he's healthy in the fall, and is probably their best receiver when everybody's on the field, Dorian Baker's going to get a lot of attention on the outside. And then I think most people, including myself, were already penciling in Lynn Bowden, the four-star recruit, as that second slot receiver who was going to be a major part of this offense. But I think Friday night, Charles Walker put things on notice a little bit, and we'd heard about him earlier in the spring too as a guy who was impressing. I think he's going to be a big part of this offense. I could see him having 20 to 30 catches this fall.
Certainly, yeah. He puts himself in position because he does the right things. He knows what's going on.
So taking a big picture look at the spring game in spring, this is kind of what you wrote about afterwards in the column on Friday night. Mark Stoops said all the things that you would expect afterward about we have a very productive spring, we have more capacity, we're getting better depth, we have less questions than we've ever had before. And most of that is true, I think, to an extent. But that's what you expect coaches to say. No one comes out after their spring game and says we were just terrible this spring and we didn't get anything out of it. But overall, what you saw Friday night and then just what we've maybe read and heard over the course of 15 practices across 6 weeks, which is a really long time for spring practice, anything change your perspective on Kentucky in the fall or what the expectations should be for this team?
Yeah, I think that I wrote about this, that the standard has been raised just because you've got 9 starters coming back on defense, 8 on offense. Special teams units return a lot, and now that they've kind of tasted what it's like to win some close games in the SEC, achieve bowl status. They didn't win that bowl game, but I think 7 wins is no longer good enough, especially because the East, again, is I'm not going to call it a down division, but it's a division full of question marks, and Kentucky actually has less question marks than usual. So I talked to Benny Snell about this, and Benny, as you know, John, is very mentally tough individual, and he's got some self-confidence that I believe he's earned. And he talks in a way that leaves you feeling really positive about the future of Kentucky.
Yeah, Benny was a guy who they did not feature a ton in the spring game. I think mostly because, you know what you have in Benny Snell, and you don't want to get that guy hurt. He's probably the best player on your team at this point. I think he had 6 touches, was productive in the touches, but the guys behind him were very good. Saheem King had 100 yards rushing against the second-team defense. A.J. Rose looked really good early, had 3 carries. The first one went for a long game before he got knocked out by a hit from Eli Brown. Apparently everything's fine. Mark said after the game he's going to be no lingering health issues there, but we did not get to see him with the first-team offense, which I think Eddie Grant said he wanted to see, and it would have been an interesting storyline for us to see that as well. But for both those running backs behind Benny to be really good on Friday and to show some things, Eddie Grant said there's even more from Saheem King because they have some things built into the offense specifically for him that they didn't use on Friday because they were very basic on both sides of the ball. But that was an encouraging development from throughout spring practice and especially on Friday night. The other thing that I thought was really encouraging from Friday specifically was depth is such a concern on defense. To see some of those redshirt freshmen step up on that second-team defense and limit the offense in the first half. I think Jamar Watson had 3 sacks of Steven Johnson the first half, played with the first-team defense in the second half and had another sack. Jamin Davis, the early enrollee linebacker, so he's only been on campus for a couple months now. He had led all players with 8 tackles. Cordell Looney, the redshirt freshman defensive tackle, had a sack, had a nice play behind the line of scrimmage. To see some of those guys step up, I thought was a really big development for their defense moving forward.
Yes, certainly, and definitely with the pass rush, like you said, that's an area that needs to continue to improve. I think, and I don't want to get too big picture here now. We're just in April, but next season there's going to be quite a few signature opportunities for signature moments. Going to South Carolina in a game where you can distance yourself from the bottom of the division, and then having Tennessee and Florida in Commonwealth Stadium, and then later in the season at Georgia. So the East Division, again, you can make a case for maybe 3 or 4 teams possibly winning that. And I think Kentucky, though, while it would be hard to pick them ahead of some teams like Florida and Georgia, Kentucky could place itself in a position to have some games where they can win and put themselves in higher standing.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's the case, and I've kind of throughout the spring been of the opinion that they've started to separate themselves from those bottom East programs, whether it's Missouri, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, the teams that they've beaten the last couple of years. My biggest question for whether they were going to be another 6-7 win team like they were last year, or to take a leap and compete for the East, upset teams like Florida or Tennessee or maybe even Georgia in a crazy scenario, is how that quarterback position looks. And so Steven didn't do anything on Friday night to suggest that that's a definite plus, that he's way better than he was last season. I'm still pretty confident that he is going to be better than he was last year, But to have other options, I think that helps at the position. But going into this, I'm still the opinion if Kentucky's going to be a special team, if they're going to have a 8-9 win season this fall, they have to have Steven Johnson as the quarterback and Steven Johnson good. Regardless of how good Gunnar Hoke looked on Friday night, regardless of how talented Drew Barker is, with his health questions aside, if he's 100%, I just don't see them having that kind of season with a redshirt freshman who's never played a game, with a junior in Drew Barker who's started 4 or 5 games in his career and has not had a ton of success on the field and has now been out for almost an entire year with a back injury. I think you got to have Steven Johnson at that position and playing really well. That's still a question after Friday night, but I think mostly for spring it was kind of a holding serve in terms of expectations.
I agree, and not having C.J. Conrad, a tight end out there, and like you said, you had Johnson not playing at wide receiver. Just didn't have all the pieces together, and of course, whenever you bring in the freshman class too, things will change up a little bit with some playmakers too. So, I think the feeling, like you said, I think Steven held serve, and we'll see what happens in the fall.
It wasn't all positive. Before we move on to basketball, there were a couple of negative developments I think from Friday night that we probably need to discuss. First off, Jordan Jones, the starting weak side linebacker, ranked 6th in the SEC in tackles last season, or tackles for loss. I think 3rd in total tackles, was UK's, if not their best player on defense, their second best player. Is from all indications, a blossoming star that if he can put it all together, could be one of the best linebackers in the country, if not in the SEC. Was suspended for the spring game for missing a team meeting Friday morning. We had seen him at open practice the week before have some moments where it looked like his energy got the best of him and he lost his composure a little bit on the sideline. That has been an issue for Jordan throughout his career. Every time you ask a coach about Jordan Jones and what's the key for him taking that next step, it's about being more mature. It's about being more mentally focused on every play. And that, I thought, was a bad sign for him. You get one chance in the spring to really go out and shine in front of the fans and show that you've put in that work. And to throw that away with a silly mistake that I don't think is going to linger. It's not like it's going to get punished into the summer or the fall. But that's not a good sign in terms of if he's going to be mature the way that they need him to. That's a pretty bad start, I thought.
Yeah, I think that you got to hope that this is, I guess you call it a wake-up call.
Yeah.
But for Jordan, that energy that you're talking about, I'm sure he uses that on the football field, and that's part of what makes him so successful and gives him an edge. But he's got to figure out a way now. He's not the same guy that he was a year ago. He's not going to be under the radar. He's not going to take anybody by surprise. Like you said, he had 109 tackles last year. It's time for him to be a leader. And you can handle mistakes of aggression. You can handle some things happening on the football field maybe that you call mistakes, but there's no excuse for missing a meeting. And there's certainly no excuse for having to put your coaches in a position where they suspend you for the spring game. So it's not acceptable.
And the other kind of definite issue of concern, I think, heading out of spring is the punting job, which was a position of concern coming into spring.
And has been for a really long time, right?
For most of a year now. Talking to Dean Hood, the new special teams coordinator, both at his introductory press conference before spring practice and then a couple times throughout spring practice, he thought Grant McInnes and what he had been told when he took the job was very good in practice, has all the talent you need with the big leg to punt impressive numbers and be a weapon as a punter. But the issue has been before translating that practice performance onto the field, whether it's a confidence issue, whether it's being secure in your blockers and feeling like you're protected, whatever the case may be, he has not been able to do that. We saw last year he was so inconsistent. At times he would show off that leg and would be a weapon, and then he would look terrible at other times. And they think it's mostly a mental thing in terms of being confident and showing that on the field. So whenever you ask Dean Hood during spring practice, well, how's Grant doing? Is he better? Is he more consistent? He would say, well, I don't think we're going to know until we see him out there in a game situation in front of a crowd because that's been the issue before. Practice has never been the problem. Well, we saw that on Friday night. There were no kickoffs. Punts weren't live, so literally all they did was snap the ball to Grant McInnes. No one rushed him. He just had the chance to kick it as far as he could down the field, and Charles Walker was going to call a fair catch, and he punted 7 times and averaged 36.7 yards per punt in a completely dead situation with no rushers coming at him with just 20,000 fans or whatever it was in the stands. That's a real worry. I mean, they're adding a graduate transfer from Columbia and Matthew Panton, the Aussie-style punter this summer, but he's a short yardage specialist. At least he was at Columbia, working, moving the pocket and kicking directionally, whatever it may be. But I don't think, at this point, I almost think you have to have to put him as the favorite to start at punter this fall because for whatever reason, it's not clicked for Grant McInnes, and that's a big concern.
Yeah, and that's disappointing because, again, you're wanting those special teams unit to turn the corner. And Mark Stoops has talked about this repeatedly since I've arrived, is that it seems like the whole time that the special teams unit goes out there, you're just sort of holding your breath and hoping nothing bad happens, and you're wanting to get that turned and try to turn that into a plus, and it just hasn't quite happened on the punt unit.
So we'll see what happens with Grant McInnes this summer. Obviously, it's going to be July before we hear from these guys again in extensive terms. SEC Media Days, the first, second week of July. Then the talking tour starts with all of Mark Stoops' appearances at Rotary Club and kickoff luncheons and the Louisville Alumni Club and all those things that happen leading up to the start of fall camp the first week of August or so. So it'll be here before we know it, but until then, it's going to be a bunch of recruiting news. Planning this week to a story talking to some recruiting guys about Jaron Williams, the 2018 quarterback recruit from Kentucky, has in the class, committed now, but is getting big offer after big offer. Alabama offered last week, almost a year to the day after they offered Mac Jones, and of course, eventually they ended up flipping Mac Jones from Kentucky to Alabama. So we'll see how that goes. That's the big football storyline to watch, but recruiting with basketball is in full swing now as they try and close out this 2017 class. Fletcher, you last week were at the Derby Classic practices in Louisville to get a look at one Kentucky commitment and one guy they're still recruiting, it appears. What were your kind of takeaways from that event?
Yeah, I came away really impressed with Gill Alexander. Still working through his name, but he's somebody who I didn't have any experience seeing in person, and I'd seen most of the other guys at McDonald's. So to see him, to hear him, very mature. He's somebody that moved to the States from Canada 2 years ago. His recruiting kind of took off after that. So he's got some experience, not just in basketball, but in traveling the world a little bit. I was impressed with I asked him, it's still staggering to me. You say, you're going to come in with maybe 8 other guys in your class. How's that going to work? Is that intimidating? Are you keeping up with it the same way we are? And he basically he said that he talks to the staff every day. They don't really talk about recruiting. He's trusted the staff to handle that. That's not any of his business, he said. He said he wanted to work on being able to play on the floor with Quad A Green together in a 2-point guard look, which to me is intriguing, considering what we might talk about in a second, Jared Vanderbilt's injury. And also that he said he wanted to defend and that he wanted to get his teammates involved and that his shooting and his scoring would come after that, which I found to be pretty mature. So that's an intriguing idea if you think about putting Quad A Green, Gill Alexander on the court together, maybe with Diallo. And last year we saw this, and we can talk about this later, but Isaiah Briscoe's 6'3". Yep. Malik Monk is 6'3". Those guys spent 81% of the minutes at the 3, trying to guard guys like Justin Jackson who are 6'8". So now if you infuse if you change the lineup a little bit with guys that are 6'5", or Jared Vanderbilt who's 6'9", I don't think that Kentucky's going to be as skilled next season as they were last season, but they're certainly going to be more athletic and more versatile.
I thought it was interesting with all the talk about shooting being a concern, and obviously that's part of the reason they added Jamar Baker last week. Gilgis Alexander won the 3-point shooting contest Saturday night at the Derby Festival Classic. Apparently shot 38% or something like that for a season. So he may not be the best shooter in the world, but it seems like he's at least competent there. So to me, that adds even more incentive to get him on the court with Quad A Green at times together, because both those guys, are going to be 2 of their 3 or 4 best shooters on the team, it appears. And so if one of them's on the court to bring the ball up, then the other one might be open for a little bit more on the perimeter to stretch defenses out. Maybe that's we'll see what Jamar Baker does. Maybe he's going to come in and start from day one. But I would think being both those other guards together, it lessens the importance of him making an immediate impact.
Certainly. And I think, too, with Mark Smith, the update there is he is going to visit Kentucky this week. Maybe before you've listened to this podcast, the Jamal Baker commitment, he said, did not change his view on Kentucky. It did not change the way that Kentucky was recruiting him, he said. So that tells you that the Wildcats the staff wants to take as many guards and shooters as they can. I saw an update from Cam Johnson from over the weekend that said Kentucky's coaches were not among the teams that visited him. So while he's still considering them, They did not go visit him personally as of Monday morning. So I'm not sure when that might have been set up. So those are the kind of the options left. Mark Smith from Illinois, 6'5" guard, and then the Pitt grad transfer, 6'8" guard, and perhaps another name will emerge, but as of right now it hasn't.
And it seems like Johnson's going to be a guy who maybe lets this go a little bit decision-wise. I mean, I think I read somewhere today that he graduates in April, obviously, at the end of April, and he's probably not going to take visits until after that. So then by that point, you would think Kentucky has a much better idea of what their roster is going to look like in terms of Bamba, and is there a chance that Kevin Knox still comes, although it appears that's not going to happen, whatever Mark Smith does. So then maybe it's a little clearer picture as to the need for Cam Johnson. For me, he's still 1A in terms of, I mean, Bamba obviously is your biggest target, but after Bamba, I think Cam Johnson makes as much sense as anybody in terms of who they're looking at in this class.
I think so, just because they need a little bit more veteran presence. And again, he's 6'8" and can shoot the 41% clip. As far as Mark Smith goes, it's got to be we asked him this, but it's got to be a little overwhelming for a guy. He grew up watching Kentucky. He said the Blue Bloods. He watched Kentucky and Illinois. Was a fan of Kentucky, and he said he was speechless when John Calipari walked in his house. They reached out to him a month ago, and since that time, he's had Kentucky, Michigan State, Ohio State, all these programs coming in here at the end. He's a guy, for those that don't know, played a lot of sports growing up, didn't really focus on basketball until recently, so he's just really coming into his own on the court. And to have all these teams coming in here at the end has got to be a little overwhelming for him. So I expect his decision will be made certainly before the end of April.
I think it would be interesting to see if they took him now, not knowing what Cam Johnson's going to do. I mean, that seems to, if that's the case, you would think that you get one or the other just by the terms of roster spots. So if they're comfortable enough with Mark Smith to go ahead and take his commitment before they know what Cam Johnson's going to do, I think that's a big vote of confidence in that kid in terms of the potential they see in him, and with some of the things you talked about in terms of being a late bloomer. That's another guy with Baker and Gill Alexander and some of these other players in this class that appear not to be one and dones, to where this is just more and more looking like a class that could be an instant impact class, but could also develop a little bit down the road for Kentucky.
Certainly, yeah. And, Mark Smith, again, another guy where you're saying, well, look at the class, like 7 or 8 other guys coming into Kentucky. Does this really make sense? Kentucky's known for one and done, so, that's always talked about. And he said that was part of why he's considering Kentucky. He said he wanted to be developed into an NBA player. So he's not backing down from the competition. And that's to me, is a theme across this class. I keep asking, and I'm not trying to stir up, any anxious feelings, but I keep asking, how's this going to work? Or how do you feel about coming in with 3 or 4 guards or 3 or 4 forwards? And everybody seems to be really anticipating those practices. John Calipari talks about becoming the best version of yourself. And if Mark Smith wants to be that, it seems that they've really sold him on competing against Diallo and Green and Gill Alexander.
Yeah, and I think those guys, you got to have the confidence. Obviously, when you bring in 4-star guards or whatever position it may be in a John Calipari class who are backups projected their first year, you got to worry about them getting over-recruited in subsequent years afterwards, and do you get locked into that spot beforehand? But I will say, to Calipari's credit, he's given those guys a chance, and if those guys prove capable of contributing, they don't go away. I mean, you think about Dominique Hawkins, who was as much of an kind of second-tier recruit as John Calipari's ever going to sign, and he made an impact early that freshman year. Obviously had to battle for minutes the rest of his career, but he proved early on that he was a player that could help Kentucky, and John Calipari never really forgot about him. Even the one season where they were 38-1 and had 10 guys who were NBA picks probably, that Hawkins didn't play very much then, but then you see him come back as a senior and a junior and play huge roles for this team down the stretch. So I think guys like Mark Smith and Jamal Baker and those guys can make a statement as freshmen, and then if they do that, then you're less worried about them getting over-recruited. Even if Kentucky brings in more All-Americans in the future, they can still play big roles. But the other path, obviously, is a guy like Charles Matthews, who played as a backup as a freshman, saw the writing on the wall with guys like Malik Monk coming in and decided his best path was elsewhere. So maybe we see that with some of these guys down the road too. But for now, it appears that John Calipari is not just building for the present; he's building for the future, which has not necessarily always been the case at Kentucky.
Certainly, and you can go up and down this roster, which I have and will continue to do so. You can make a case like we just did, like I just did at the 1, 2, and 3, but then it really gets interesting at the 4 and 5. And I think the curveballs are Bam Adebayo potentially returning. I don't see that happening, but it could happen. And then you add Mo Bamba to a group that's, like I said, already extremely versatile.
So the other development UK basketball recruiting-wise from the weekend was Jared Vanderbilt's injury. This happens right after the spring games wrapping up. We're in the press box at Commonwealth Stadium, and it kind of starts trickling down the line that Vanderbilt may have had a significant injury in the All-Star game he was participating in that night. Any sort of update? What just maybe run us through the status of Jared Vanderbilt at the moment?
Right. Well, it didn't look good, obviously, when you see somebody inside a minute left to go in an all-star game. And at this point, there's so many of these events. Yeah. I mean, it's McDonald's and Jordan Brand and Nike Hoop Summit and, USA, U19, and all this stuff's going on. And you get to this point now, it's April, where you're saying, okay, when are you supposed to be at Kentucky? Yeah. Or the Derby Classic? I mean, everybody's everywhere. The update, we'll find out. It's Monday right now. We'll find out sooner than later. Again, this is a player, Jared Vanderbilt, who I'm not going to call him under the radar at all. Obviously, he's a 5-star recruit, but he's dealt with foot and leg injuries now for going on a year, and that kind of limited his the availability on AAU last summer. It limited him in his senior season, even though he was still exceptional. And now you've got another foot, looks like another ankle injury. So with him, he's a guy that had a tremendous time at the McDonald's All-American game. Great practices, looked great, and now you're thinking, wow, like I said, Isaiah Briscoe was trying to guard Justin Jackson. If you replace that with a 6'9" Jared Vanderbilt that can shoot threes and can create his own shot, that changes the way that Kentucky might play next season. And I still expect that he'll be back at some point. I'm not a doctor, but again, it just sort of makes you contemplate how many ways that Kentucky can play and what kind of lineups they have next season.
I think that's a really intriguing point, because that 3 spot, as much as any other spot on the roster, is the one that I don't know that John Calipari has ever found a guy who was, a top NBA lottery kind of pick at the 3 specifically. Michael Kidd-Gilchrist is probably the closest he's came to that, but he was a combo kind of guard forward, whatever it may be. But that spot, we've seen him try and go the last couple of years with 3 guards, whether it was, Fox, Monk, and Briscoe this year, or Ulis, Murray, and Briscoe the year before. We've seen him try and go big at times with Alex Boythris and Trey Lyles playing the 3. We've seen him, try a number of different things, and he's never had that guy at that position. So that's why Jared Vanderbilt, to me, as much as anybody, is really intriguing on this team, to see what he can do, if he can shoot, if he can defend, if he can show that athleticism and do what he can do there. I think that's a player that John Calipari probably really hasn't had at Kentucky. Maybe Kidd-Gilchrist is the closest example there, but what he could do with a weapon at that position who's really built for that position specifically, I think is really intriguing and something I'm excited to see the fall. Right.
Well, last season, if you have Briscoe there at 6'3", playing the 3, and then you have Derek Willis playing the 4, you obviously are giving up a lot on in terms of height and then maybe bulk. This season, coming in, you were thinking, okay, Vanderbilt at the 3 at 6'9", plays like a guard, and then maybe P.J. Washington, who has a more traditional 4 look with a bigger body. That would completely change the way. And again, I think that having Malik and Isaiah play the 3, it fit what they wanted to do last year in terms of being up-tempo on offense, and they were willing to give up some on defense. But I think you're going to see Kentucky transform a little bit and play in a different style, depending on Vanderbilt's availability. And to your point, I think Kevin Knox would have fit exactly what you're talking about. And it's unfortunate it doesn't look like it's going to work out for Kentucky, because if you put him in there, I think he's what you're saying, that traditional 3, that NBA-looking 3.
Yeah, and the Trey Lyles example brings up another point in terms of Vanderbilt. We don't know what the prognosis long term for the injury is, but assuming it's not something that keeps him out in games in the fall, it's not a huge concern at this point of the year. This is when you would like something like that to happen, because you think back to that under the 38-1 team. Trey Lyles was hurt the entire summer, did not play with them in the Bahamas when they went and had that preseason tour. And obviously was a great player who developed into a first-round pick as a one-and-done player. So that him being hurt this summer and missing conditioning, if that were to happen, which we don't know if that's the case or not, I don't think would be the end of the world for Kentucky's prospects this fall. His injury history makes it maybe a little bit more concern, but I don't think Kentucky fans should necessarily be throwing their head in the sand and thinking, oh, well, here it goes necessarily right now.
Well, what really changes everything is Mo Bamba. You bring him in, and he lets your diversity sort of shine because he's a 7-footer that can play the 4 or the 5. And now you're talking about being able to move P.J. Washington around a few spots, maybe the 3 or the 4. Nick Richards is a guy that I think 6'11". He's got some finesse to him. He's got to develop a little bit more, but if you could pair him with Bamba, that's intriguing. And again, if you could have maybe Vanderbilt at 6'9" at the 3, I mean, P.J. Washington told me at the McDonald's game that he didn't see a lot of shots in the paint that weren't going to get sent back out. So a lot of athleticism, and Mo Bamba would really, I think, enable Calipari to have some pretty crazy, interesting lineup combinations.
Yeah, and obviously we're going to find out more about what that roster is going to look like over the next couple of weeks as some more of these recruiting decisions get made. We'll definitely hit on that next week on the podcast and in future podcasts as spring football has come to a close. We're recording this on Monday, Tuesday night at Cliff Hagan Stadium. Kentucky welcomes number 14. Kentucky welcomes number 2 Louisville in baseball to Lexington. Kentucky lost to Louisville a couple of weeks ago. Get a chance to hand the cards, what I think would be just their 5th loss of the season. That's a huge game for them. They've got LSU coming in on the weekend, which is a huge game for them. Just took 2 out of 3 from Missouri over the weekend. Are still a couple games up in first place in the SEC East. I think they're the second-ranked SEC team in Baseball America's top 25 now. So from all indications, Kentucky baseball well on their way to earning a regional host that first weekend of the tournament. We'll talk more about them in future podcasts too as basketball and football kind of wraps up and slows down here a little bit. But for now, thanks for listening. I'm John Hale at JohnHale_CJ on Twitter. He's at Fletcher Page on Twitter. Follow us both on Twitter. Like the Cats HQ page on Facebook. Check out courier-journal.com and the print edition of the CJ for all our coverage moving forward. Thanks for listening.